Great. Well, so we're so happy you're here, and that goes for everybody. But so for all newcomers, Braver Angels is a national nonprofit that works to bring people together across the partisan divide. We do that through a whole series of different activities, workshops, debates like this one-on-one exchanges, and media. And so there's a whole adventure waiting for you. And we're glad that this is your first step in the door. So Braver Angels debate is different than what a lot of people think of when they think of the word debate. And so I'm just going to take a second and explain that. When a lot of people hear the word debate, they think of maybe a congressional debate or a presidential debate where people are sort of using talking points, or they think about competitive debate, like the kind you do in high school and college, where there are speaker points and like one side wins, then they advance to the next round and all that. And we are pro debate, so we're in favor of lots of kinds of debate, but our variety is a little bit different. And the biggest difference is actually in the spirit of it. So we say here at Braver Angels that our debates, the spirit is of a collective search for truth. And so the goal isn't per se to win. The goal is to get closer to the truth with all the other folks here. And so we think together, and that leads to our most important rule, which is that we invite people who are speaking to say what they believe. And all these panelists here tonight know that and are excited and ready to do that. But you can know and trust that what they're saying is what they actually think. It's not a case or something where they're like listing all the statistics that suit their favor, but leaving out everything else. They're here to say what they actually do believe. And I just want to give a brief note about the issue for tonight. So we are called Braver Angels for a reason. And this debate is shaping up to be our most controversial ever. And so I just want to, first of all, say that I'm glad you're here. All of you out there and everyone here on the screen tonight, very glad you're here. Braver Angels takes on the tough issues because we believe it's not possible to heal the country without talking about these things. We're having this debate because some folks told us, and people said this directly to me, that they can't take Braver Angels seriously if we don't talk about this issue. Other people have told us that they aren't sure they can be part of Braver Angels because we're talking about this issue in this way. And the interesting thing is, so we have a really interesting panel coming up for you tonight. And we have panelists here today who have said both of those things directly and believe both of those things. And so it really is a all perspectives on this subject are welcome. If you have other questions about why we would talk about this, there's a podcast we recorded earlier this week where some of the leaders of Braver Angels sort of did our internal staff meeting publicly and talked about it. Like, why would we do that? What are the pitfalls? How do we think about this? So I recommend that to you. And I also just want to set expectations. So each of our speakers will have 4 minutes and then a 2-minute response time. And that's not actually enough time to nail down every single fact and every single claim about evidence or lack thereof sort of fully to the ground. And so just know that that's not what we are sort of here primarily to do. However, we're planning to do some of that in follow-up media. So there's a podcast we're planning where advocates on both sides will go through each claim and other media sort of with that. So keep an eye out for that. What we are here to do tonight is to have an effective, sincere, and real conversation about one of the issues that is dividing America more than almost any other these days. And so that's what we're here for. And I have full confidence that the folks that we've selected will, and the folks that are here and are going to voice their views will help us do that. And finally, last but not least, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. We have an excellent slate tonight, and I will introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. So David Iwinski is a lawyer and entrepreneur from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with an equal passion for global business and rescuing poodles. Brenda Blossingame is a new member of Braver Angels and a long-timer in getting into good trouble on behalf of children and their families. Paul Norris worked at Apple Computer in the 1980s and as a database specialist at UCSF. He is currently retired, but works part-time in the field of mental health. Silas Kulkarni is a leader on the Braver Angels debate team, a former teacher in high poverty schools, and a nonprofit leader working for educational equity. Mark Ang is a Southern California-based community leader who runs a nonprofit Asian industry B2B, which engages business owners to impact the community and highlights different charitable causes, such as fighting poverty and homelessness, health and wellness, and anti-human trafficking. Kim Watson is the Blue co-chair of the Southwest Ohio Alliance and also participated in the Braver Angels documentary, Reuniting America. Steve House has spent 30 years in healthcare, and his political experience includes being a county and state party chairman in Colorado, as well as a candidate for governor and Congress, and he has participated in the election process as a judge and as a poll watcher. And Shovik Banerjee is the founder of Averpoint, a community credibility layer for digital content with a mission to help honest voices win online. He previously worked in the Obama White House, Department of Energy, and Solar City, once the nation's largest solar installer. So with a round of jazz hands for everyone here, come on guys, show me your jazz hands, thank you. I'm gonna call this debate to order. On the topic resolved, voter fraud is a major problem in US elections. We will start with an affirmative speech, and I'd like to call on David Iwinski. You have 4 minutes, go ahead.
Thank you, April. Voter fraud is a major problem in US elections, and I speak in the affirmative. I do believe voter fraud is a major problem, and I believe it's conscious, organized, and that the last presidential election was significantly corrupted by coordinated effort. I'm not the only one. A significant majority of the 74 million people who voted for Donald Trump feel the same. This issue isn't going away. We're not going away. This won't fade with time. And the hopes that this will somehow just come out of the consciousness of those folks is one that is not correct. Now, presidential elections being rigged is nothing new. Newsweek recently wrote an article where they documented 5 rigged elections since the founding of the country. That's about 11% of all presidential elections, the most modern being 1960 John Kennedy over Richard Nixon. Now, I can't cite every statistic in the next 3 minutes, but here's a couple. Highest voter turnout, extraordinarily high. Wisconsin had over 90%. Australia has mandatory registration and mandatory voting, but they still never get 92. Biden dramatically outperforms Obama's percentages and totals. I mean, does anybody truly believe that Joe Biden is more popular than Barack Obama? But 450,000 ballots showed up, Biden only. No down ballot candidates got a vote. And these were all coming in battleground states. And oddly enough, most of them in the middle of the night. And finally, absence of mail-in vote vetting. In my state of Pennsylvania, just 3% of 1% of mail-in ballots were rejected. All of these happening simultaneously is highly improbable. And if it were reversed and this was in favor of Donald Trump, you can bet there'd be investigations. Now, some say even to ask these questions devalues elections and creates feelings of insecurity. Folks, that ship has sailed. These questions are already out there. The insecurity exists. And we have to ask these questions to take the hard action of rooting out the truth. And what are we afraid of? The truth? I believe there was election fraud, but I don't know it. And I am absolutely willing to be convinced that I'm wrong and have my mind changed without question. But how? Well, I want my day in court. Now, some folks will say, oh, golly, Dave, the courts have rejected all these. No, there has not been a proceeding with evidence. There's not been a proceeding with subpoenas and folks under oath. The rejections have been for procedural reasons and standing reasons. This is essentially if you see someone commit a murder, but because the Miranda warning is read inappropriately, that's set free. Doesn't mean there was no crime, doesn't mean that the person isn't guilty, but it means that they're set free. There has not been an adjudication. So what's to be done? If we had a bipartisan committee, something on the order of the Warren Commission, and it could be put together simply. Trump names 3, Biden names 3, those 6 name 3 more. They could have subpoena power, they could have witnesses under oath, take depositions, come up with findings, and those findings could be published with recommendations. Interestingly enough, I believe if that happened, no matter what those outcomes, it would galvanize public opinion towards a bipartisan effort to streamline and create secure, accurate, reliable voting procedures. And isn't that what we want? Because really, when you get down to it, This is about election integrity. I love this country. I love it dearly. I've worked all over the world, and I'm one of those folks that likes to kiss the ground when I get back to America. But election integrity is crucial and should be a matter of partisan support, not red, not blue, but all of us. Without it, we can never be confident that our leaders are truly those selected by our citizens. And the legitimacy of their actions and the standing of the United States and the world community will suffer until this issue is addressed and corrected. Thank you.
All right, jazz hands for our brave first speaker. Woohoo. All right, so we're going to take one panelist question, and so you can go ahead and raise your hands, panelist, if you want to. And then I just want to give a heads up to Carol Worthman and Ethan Abelman. We will come to your questions next. So for our first panelist question, Silas Kulkarni, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Iwinski. Mr. Iwinski said that all these were thrown out on procedural grounds, not on substantive grounds. I want to read a quote here, and I want him to say if this is a procedural ground. Charges of unfairness are serious, but calling an election unfair does not make it so. Charges require specific allegations and then proof. We have neither here. That's Judge Stefanos Bibas, federal judge from 3rd U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals at Philadelphia, who was a Trump appointee. So you said it was, or the gentleman said that it was all procedural grounds, but this judge, a Trump appointee, said there was no evidence whatsoever of the claim. How does he respond to that?
All right, Mr. Iwinski.
Madam Chair, that's a great question. And perhaps there were from this judge, and I don't know the actual facts of the case presented to this judge, he may have felt that there were not legitimate points. However, this ruling did not apply to the dozens and perhaps hundreds of suits that were filed all over the country. And so we can say, yes, and I find this often true in fact checkers. There was a quote where one said with some hyperbole that the win by Biden was 1 in a quadrillion. And the fact checkers jumped all over it and said, well, you can't prove a quadrillion, 1 in a quadrillion. Okay, maybe it was 1 in 400 million. But the reality is that finding one specific judge who said that does not invalidate the reality that many, if not most, of these were thrown out for standing reasons. There has not been, to my knowledge, an actual adjudication with subpoenas, with witnesses under oath, and with opposing counsel cross-examining. That's something that I would be very interested in seeing, and I think the American people deserve it.
All right, excellent. So we're now going to go to attendee questions, and we're going to start with Carol Worthman. Carol, you can unmute yourself. You had a question about defining voter fraud.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. My question is, would you please provide a precise definition of voter fraud?
Thank you for that question. Voter fraud as a term encompasses many, many things. For example, in my state, Pennsylvania, voter watchers were denied access. This was videoed during the election. They were denied access to vote. Voter fraud can also be adding ballots or after the period has elapsed by which they were intended to be submitted. Voter fraud can be having folks that are in graveyards voting. So there is a precise definition. It would probably encompass 10 or 15 various methodologies. And so I can't list all of them in 1 minute, but actually when you look through the various claims and allegations, there were numerous types and styles of voter fraud that were alleged. And again, some may be adjudicated eventually, I hope, to not be true. But until they are, they remain, in my mind, a question that may be open and may be correct.
All right, excellent. And then Ethan Abelman, you had a question about trust. I've enabled you to speak. Please ask your question to me.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. So in a way, the resolution at hand is about who you trust. Some in the media and government say that voter fraud is a problem, while others do not. I ask the speaker who he chooses to trust in the media and government, and why.
Well done. All right.
Wonderful, wonderful question. It is about trust.
It's a really good question.
And that's the reason why in my recommendation, you get a panel of Biden chooses 3, Trump chooses 3, and then they together choose 3 more, because trust is really at the heart of this issue. And so if any partisan commission does this, I've noticed, by the way, in the prior election, 2016, the Democrats alleged fraud, spent tens of millions of dollars in an impeachment of Trump that took 3 years, didn't prove anything, but were those results trustworthy? So I really think that in order for this to be effective, the trust has to be embodied in an independent commission, not tied to politicians. And if there are politicians, they must be equally balanced, by the way, just like braver angels.
All right. And with that, the speaker is thanked. Thank you, Mr. Iwinski. Yes, jazz hands, absolutely. All right, we will now go to our first speech in the negative. And before we do, I just want to remind folks that we do invite you to submit questions. You can do that via our whips have been posting the link in the chat. And so if you have a question you want to submit live time, go ahead and use that link. So for our first speech in the negative, Ms. Blassingame.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is there voter fraud? Of course. No system is perfect. Is it a major problem? I do not think so. Last night, Ben Ginsburg said, when he was speaking, that there was no credible election fraud. He was in the Bush administration, worked for the Republican National Committee on these issues, and does election analysis. I think that we've been talking a lot about voter fraud, and it's increased in the 2020 election. The Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative group, has had an election fraud database for around 4 years. And over that 4-year period of time, what they've found is 1,285 proven instances of voter fraud. The Brenneman Center, which is a nonpartisan group, put out a seminal report on the issue. The report found incident rates between 0.0003% and 0.025%. And I could go on because in 2009, there was an analysis that looked at 12 states and found that voter fraud was very rare. And that they also concluded that many of the cases that garnered media attention were ultimately unsubstantiated upon further review. In 2012, a study exhaustively pulled records from every state for all alleged election fraud and found the overall fraud rate to be infinitesimal, and impersonation fraud by voters at the polls to be the rarest fraud of all. Only 10 cases alleged in 12 years. The same exact study found only 56 alleged cases of non-citizen voting in 12 years also. And then a review of the 2016 election found 4 documented cases of voter fraud. The court and the government investigations have found the same. Now, with all of that said, I would be 100% in support of a nonpartisan investigation of the 2020 election, as David said, because I want integrity in our voting system also, just like he does. I don't believe voter fraud is a problem, but voter suppression is, and we should be concerned because there's plenty of evidence of it going back over 150 years. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited disenfranchising voters on the basis of race, color, or previous condition from not being able to automatically vote, but it did give automatic rights to African Americans to vote. And it wasn't until 1997 that Tennessee was the last state that actually formally ratified the 15th Amendment. Voting rights have also been denied in various ways for those who are convicted of crimes through felon disenfranchisement laws. And the justice system is filled with Black and brown people. Until the mid-60s, things such as poll taxes and literacy tests were used in terms of denying voting to some. Then there is the ongoing redistricting approaches that are more and more about setting up districts so that the voting in that district is in favor of one political party over another and gives an unfair advantage. Since 2008, states across The country had passed measures to make it harder for Americans, particularly Black people, the elderly, students, and people with disabilities to exercise their fundamental right to cast a ballot. Since 2010, 25 states have put into place new requirements, such as voter ID laws, closing polling places, cutbacks to early voting. Now, right now, there are at least 165 bills restricting voting access that have been proposed in 33 state legislatures across our country. That's more than 4 times as many that have been proposed in February of 2020. When I hear this statement, if we don't do something about voting by mail, we're going to lose the ability to elect a Republican in this country, and a statement like, if Republicans don't challenge and change the US election system, there will never be another Republican president elected again. That makes me wonder, is there really voter fraud happening? Or is the real issue here voter suppression? Voting in this country is a right. The system needs to have integrity. It has to be country above party. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you. And jazz hands for our brave first speaker in the negative. Yes, very good. So we'll go to a panelist question, and then Daniel O'Brien, if you are there, we'll go to you, and Maxim Shrogan. So just letting you know. For our panelist question, Mr. House, go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Madam Chair, I would like to ask the presenter, Brenda, a question regarding voter suppression. Let me qualify by saying that I also believe that voter suppression is an integral part of election integrity, and we must include it as part of the discussion. However, in this election, we had a record turnout. We had a record turnout among minorities, a record turnout among women. There are more ways to register to vote than there's ever been. More states have same-day voter registration, and Uber and Lyft would literally pick you up and take you to the polls to vote. I don't see voter suppression, given those statistics, as being a major factor in this election. I'd simply like you to comment on your view of that, given that we've had those records.
All right, go ahead.
Sure. I believe that what happened in this election with the major voter turnout that we have seen is a rising up of people because they are tired of what has been happening before. I don't think everybody can take a Lyft or take an Uber. I don't think everybody has access in certain ways. I do think that people turned out this time because we are at a critical juncture in the history of this country, and whether or not we are going to proceed and put country first, our Constitution first, our voting rights first, or we were going to have those things taken away from us. And I believe people stood up and spoke out, and that's what we saw.
All right, very good. Now for attendee questions, we're going to start with Daniel O'Brien. I see Cynthia O'Brien, who is a debate, one of our debate chairs, and I've permitted you to talk, Cynthia. Is Daniel in your household? Same spelling of O'Brien. So that's
no, but I would look forward to meeting him sometime.
All right, very good. Daniel O'Brien, if you're in the audience, please raise your Zoom hand, and that'll help us find you. In the meantime, we're going to go to Sean Gersman.
Hi, Madam Chair. My question has to do with the mail-in voting. I think that was what was unique about the 2020 election was the tremendous amount of mail-in voting we had. And I have concerns based on number one, having voted in person and my signature was questioned. And number two, having tried to mail my mother her ballot and just found it lying around, not even secured in a mailbox. How can we trust that the mail-in voting process and the signature verification process are secure?
I think that's a great question. And I think that when we have instances like that occurred, the experience that you had, those things have to be investigated. They have to be looked into. The first statement I made is there voter fraud? absolutely, I believe there is voter fraud. There's no perfect system that exists. I think that the pandemic clearly showed that we had to have alternative ways of voting. Many of us, including me, were not going to go to a poll to vote on voting day. And so doing that massive amount of mail-in voting, of course, there's going to be some things that happen, but I think that we've had a number of people speak to even the mail-in voting and say that it was not filled with fraud. And I want to remind all of us that many times the people saying that were not seeing fraud were Republicans saying that.
Okay, thank you. And for our final question, let's go to Tom Cook. Tom, I've promoted you to panelist for the moment. Go ahead and unmute and ask us your question. All right. Sorry, you're still muted, Tom.
There we go.
There we go. All right.
Madam Speaker, my question is, at what point do efforts to remove barriers to voting turn a country's election system into one that is no longer trusted by the citizens of that country?
Interesting. All right, go ahead.
That is a very interesting question. Thank you so much. I believe that it's not about just removing the barriers, it's about removing barriers and challenges that are systematic and putting in place guardrails, firewalls, and security around doing the election. I think that we're at a point where we have amazing technology. There's a number of things I think that we can do to further promote access and build in more security. And what's important about election integrity is that it has to be across all pieces of our voting system. It has to be across the access pieces of the system. It has to be across the actual voting, the act of voting in the system. It can't be one or the other. This is a both and.
All right, very good. And with that, the speaker is thanked. Jazz hands for our brave first neg. All right, with that, we will go to our second affirmative speech, and I'd like to call on Mr. Paul Norris. Paul, go ahead and unmute, and you have 4 minutes.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd just like to say I'm both honored and slightly intimidated to follow the 2 early speakers, and I've been redrafting my speech as I've been sitting here. So was the election stolen? I don't know, and I don't expect to know in my lifetime. I do know that there were 2 elections that I remember being highly delighted with. John F. Kennedy and George Moscone as mayor of San Francisco. And I later learned that both of those elections were very likely stolen by outright fraud. I think it's true that with important contentious events, the truth is often not known or accepted until it doesn't matter anymore, or it's never known. And so I look to history to learn a lot. There are other issues we haven't touched on. Media and big tech's constant bias and increased just before the election. The buried stories of Joe Biden's sexual harassment, Hunter Biden in Ukraine. At least one study has suggested this may have been enough to change the outcome of the election. Avoiding the issue of Biden's mental clarity. Apparently he has now set a new record for how long a president has gone without an individual press conference. Responsible conservative thinkers demonetized or driven away from social media. This may not be voter suppression, but this is information suppression. Rabid information suppression. I'd just like to point out one of the sad things in America is elections are managed by the people who have the most interest in the outcome. This is a problem. And also, if we hear different people telling different stories on this debate about their vision of the process, well, maybe one person was in a place where the election was run with integrity, maybe the other person was in a very different place. I say never underestimate the amazing power of human beings to manipulate situations to their own advantage when power is involved. The most important thing, of course, is legitimacy. The most important thing in an election is the losing side genuinely believes that they lost, not that they're silenced or intimidated. And I find it frightening that the last two presidents have been considered illegitimate by the losing side, even with convincing wins in the Electoral College. These issues were looked at 20 years ago, Carter-Baker Commission. And they looked at, and one of the things, there were a whole list of things they came across. One was that they saw that absentee ballots remained the largest source of potential voter fraud. And as far as studies, I just want to say something about studies. There is a current crisis in science now, particularly psychology, studies that cannot be replicated. And they're based on shaky science and shaky motives. Well, I think this is all true in political science. Studies are frequently politicized. And if they're actually looked at by somebody who's critical, you just find holes you can drive a truck through. I was recently a graduate student taking a course in research. And they start out by saying, decide what group you want to help and then design your study to help that group. The word, I don't remember the word truth ever being mentioned in that course. So this is modern social science. I point out security has never been a true priority in US elections. And I look at numerous examples of systems that weren't designed for security. Early versions of Microsoft Windows, the internet, and our phone system. So think about email. Think about email. It was not designed for security, and look at what we've got. I think technology could offer us the solution. The will is not there in the current two-party system, but technology could do this. With the wrong design criteria or manipulation, it could make things even worse. But with the right design criteria to make it both secure and accessible, could be a real solution to what we're dealing with today.
All right. Thank you so much. Jazz hands for Mr. Norris, who is one of our debate team leaders. Thank you, sir. All right, so we'll take one panel question and then we will go to Marlene Johnson and Don Morgan. So get yourselves ready. Questions from panelists for Paul Norris. Anyone? Has he persuaded all of you?
Did I frighten you that badly?
That's fine. We can go straight to attendee questions.
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, did I frighten them that badly?
Thank you. Thank you, sir. That is correct. All right, let's start with Marlene Johnson. Marlene, go ahead and unmute. Yep, looks like you're unmuted, and ask your question to me.
Okay, Madam Chairman, here is my question. Voter fraud is a crime, and a person who commits a crime has a motive to do so. So what motive would Raffensperger, who's a Republican in Georgia and voted for Trump, wanted him to win, what motive would he have to deny that there was voter fraud in his state and support the integrity of the vote there for Biden?
All right.
You're talking about somebody I don't know, and you're asking me to make a conclusion about their inner mind.
Questioner.
Sorry. Madam Chair, the questioner is asking me to read somebody's mind who I do not even know. And I'm a psychotherapist. That's unethical for me.
All right. Let's go to Don Morgan. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question to me.
Madam Chair, when I entered my question, I did not write it down. I didn't realize that I was going to be asking it in person.
It happens.
So
it was about voter fraud and Democrats versus Republicans, if that jogs your memory.
All right.
I can just read it if you want to.
Please, that would be helpful.
Don Morgan, if there was voter fraud, why would it be on the part of Democrats and not Republicans?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Madam Chair, I feel quite certain that there is voter fraud on both sides of the aisle, depending on how one defines voter fraud. I do suspect that there might be an asymmetry You know, it might be different kinds of voter fraud coming from the different sides, at least statistically. And I've often been interested in the asymmetry between reds and blues and how that is often not recognized or understood.
All right, very good. And for a final question, we will go to Christine MacArthur. And there are 3 Christines here, so I would ask that only Christine MacArthur speak up.
Okay, that's me. I believe my question was, because you were talking about bias in the media.
The gentleman was, yeah.
Yes,
so
the gentleman, I'm sorry, the gentleman, Madam. So my question, Madam Chair, is, isn't there more of a case of bias in social media? Because of course a person can choose what media they want to read in terms of print, but social media is definitely engineered to support only your choices. So what would considering that could be, what would you do about it?
What would you do about that? Mm-hmm. Great.
Fabulous question. My first, Madam Chair, my first response is I am utterly flat-footed. I will just say that talking about social media bias was one of the things I cut out of my speech in order to get anywhere near 4 minutes. What would I do about it? I don't have any great answer. I have observed, I mean, I'm seeing that there is now a more conservative set of social media platforms being developed because so many people have given up on trying to get any kind of a fair shake out of, you know, the major platforms. And I guess I have a hope that I hope is not futile, that people will get tired of echo chambers and will start moving towards actually hearing more from the other side. And I see a lot of that happening, but I live in a sheltered world called Braver Angels.
All right, very good. And with that, Mr. Norris is thanked.
Can I take any more? That was so much fun. Can I do more?
I'm sure it was. You get 2 minutes to respond later, Paul. You know that. All righty, thank you. So I'd now like to call on our second negative speech. And for that, I will go to Silas Kulkarni. You have 4 minutes, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I like David Iwinski personally, and I appreciated his speech. I doubt that anything I say is going to change his mind or somebody who came in thinking what he's thinking. What I'm going to ask instead is maybe he and other people who think what he think about the election might just be able to understand a little bit where I'm coming from and where people like me are coming from about this debate. Because I'll tell you, I think this debate is not just an open question, but is actually a harmful question to be debating. Okay. But let me try and tell it to you using a story. So imagine you have 2 high school football teams with a bitter rivalry. Let's call them Team Red and Team Blue. The big game is coming up, and Team Red has the star quarterback, Donnie, and he's super popular on the Reds, and the Blues hate him. They think he's dirty and talks a lot of trash. Okay. Whatever you think of him, everyone agrees he's cocky and he hates to lose. So a few months before the game, he starts pumping up the team and the fans saying, we're going to crush them. There's no way we can lose. The only way we can lose is if they cheat. And you know, those dirty Blues, they're such cheaters. And the big day comes, the big game happens. It's a tough fight and the Blues win. But as soon as the game is over, that quarterback storms off the field yelling. He says, they cheated, they cheated, they cheated. We totally won it. We totally won it. And he starts riling up the fans. And they start chanting, cheaters, cheaters, cheaters. And some of them get so angry, they come rushing down the field and they attack some of the other players and they got to break it up. And the refs come in and they call the refs. And the refs look at the instant playback. No cheating. And the refs, which are actually, by the way, mostly Team Red side refs, they say, Blues won it fair and square. But the Red quarterback just can't let it go. And he just keeps yelling, cheaters, cheaters. And the crowd just keeps chanting, cheaters. And then some of the Red players say, hey guys, we lost this, you know. But more of the other Red players are like, you know, that quarterback's more popular than me. I better start chanting cheaters or else the fans are going to hate me. So they start chanting cheaters too and say, yeah, I saw it, cheating. We better look into this. And it all started with just one guy with a bald-faced lie that started before the game even got played. Because Donald Trump made the claim about cheating before a single vote was cast, months before anything happened. He said, cheating will happen, because he knew he was going to make this kind of approach. And here's where the story gets ugly, because the red coaches start saying, you know, we can use this worked up crowd and get some of the players on the blue team disqualified, and then we can win the next one easy. But honestly, at this point, I have to break the analogy, because the effort to disqualify some voters, that's not a game, that's real life. And as Ms. Blasingame said just more eloquently than I ever could, this is a made-up controversy, but it's not going to have a made-up effect, because the effort to disqualify Black and brown voters has a long history in this country. And so I want to close by saying, this isn't just an open question, because with an open question, most reasonable people say, oh, there's probably some truth on both sides, let's find a nice middle ground. But if you take a bald-faced lie and then the truth, and you find the middle ground, you have half of a lie. And if that half of a lie is used, as it will be and has been used, to take away votes from people like me and people like Ms. Blasingame, then having this debate isn't just an interesting conversation. It's a rollback of some of the most important civil rights in this country. The last thing I want to say, if you're a red and you believe this story, I don't blame you. You're the fans in the bleachers. You weren't on the field. You weren't there to watch it happen. I blame the politicians who are repeating the lie because it's in their political interest to repeat it. And with that, I yield to questions.
All right. So we'll start with a panelist question, and I'm going to go to the aforementioned David Iwinski. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I would like for you to query the speaker, who gave an excellent presentation, on what his reaction is to, in his extended analogy, if the quarterback from the other side in a game 4 years prior, Hillary was who she was, also raised allegations of cheating and actually spent, with congressional support, millions of dollars investigating it. Is this not a problem of the system rather than one really hyped up and ramped up individual telling lies? Because is it not possible that this is a systemic problem that needs to be addressed systemically, not as an individual?
So,
go ahead.
I appreciate Mr. Iwinski's question. And I just wanted to say two things in response. One, this is a systemic problem, but the systemic problem is not voter fraud. As Ms. Blasingame pointed out, and there's a lot of evidence, voter fraud occurs, but at such a small rate that it doesn't change elections. But the systemic problem of disqualifying Black and brown voters happens at a massive rate. And if you want to, if anyone wants to get into that, I would love for us to debate that in the future, because going back to, I mean, you can go back to 2000 in the Bush election, where butterfly ballots were a few hundred votes, but Black people who were eligible to vote, but who were thrown off the voter rolls by George Bush's brother, who was governor, were in the tens of thousands, and nobody reported that. Okay. But then the second thing about Russia, which is, and you know, the allegations of cheating there, there's a lot to say about that. But the simplest thing is, the facts are that Russia did interfere in our election, and the only question was whether Donald Trump was in cahoots with them or not. And so it's not the same. There was a lot of evidence that Russia interfered in our election.
Okay. So for our attendee questions, we're going to go to Jeff Clark and then Jerry McAmey. So Jeff, go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Madam Chair, if you do the calculations based on the polls, there are at least 45 million American voters who have serious concerns about the election. And to quote Clarence Thomas from a recent SCOTUS 6-3 minority opinion, he said, "Elections enable self-governance only when they include processes that give citizens, including the losing candidates and their supporters, confidence in the fairness of the election." I'd like the speaker to address that.
Okay.
This is kind of the point I'm driving at. It's a political tactic, okay? So if you have a bunch of politicians repeat something that is a bald-faced lie enough times, a lot of people are going to believe that. Because why do people believe things? For the same reason I believe what I believe, because I've heard it a lot of times. And then I might look into it, and then I look in the media silo that I'm in, just like everybody else to the media silo there, and you find confirming information. And so to say that just because a lot of people believe it must mean that there's a problem that has to be addressed. No, a lot of people believe it because there's a smart, devious political tactic. Repeat a lie enough times, and then enough people will believe it, and then you get them to address something that wasn't there, and you move the goalposts.
All right, and for a final question, we'll go to Jerry McNamee. Jerry, go ahead, and I hope I'm not butchering your name. Unmute and ask your question to me.
Madam Chair, I'd like to ask the last speaker, why do you think it's harmful to discuss this issue?
Okay, there's two reasons. One, and I want the questioner to put himself in my shoes, okay? Everywhere where the accusations that were coming out about voter fraud were most prevalent were in places where it was high Black and brown populations, largely in the cities, okay? So what people are saying is cheating isn't, if people say cheating happens, that's one thing. But if you say, oh, all the Black and brown people in the cities are cheaters, okay, that's me. I'm a brown man who lives in a city. And they're calling me a cheater, and they're calling people like me a cheater. And second of all, most people, when you debate a question, you have to, someone will say, oh, well, the truth has got to be somewhere in the middle. And if somewhere in the middle is some Black and brown people are cheaters, then what we do is we say, okay, let's make it really hard for people to vote so we can be confident in this beautiful word, election integrity, and take away some of the Black and brown people's right to vote. And that's a middle ground that is the opposite of civil rights, in my opinion. And so, calling me a cheater and people like me a cheater and then taking away some of our rights, that's not a fair compromise. That's a compromise with an effort to advantage some politicians at the expense of some citizens.
All right. And with that, Mr. Kulkarni is thanked. Jazz hands for Mr. Kulkarni. All right, very good. And we will now go to our next affirmative speaker, Mr. Ang. So Mark Ang, go ahead and unmute yourself, and you have 4 minutes.
Thank you, April. Thank you, Braver Angels, for throwing this debate. Contrary to the last speaker, I'm just going
to interrupt you for a second, Mark. We can't see your face. That might be because of bandwidth, but we'd love to see your face if you're up for it.
Okay, yeah. Let me just. Okay, can you see me now?
Yes, great. Thank
okay,
you.
Yeah, I was referring to my notes on the same phone, but I know what I'm going to say anyways. So, this fraud has been going on for a long time, and I'm kind of in the heart of, seeing it uniquely. I think as a community organizer and dealing with a lot of different, coalitions and different groups of people, especially in very diverse Southern California. So, I'd like to first say. How about disenfranchising Black and brown conservatives? I know so many in Southern California that feel that their vote has been suppressed by the fact that we have these machines that are going on in the cities. So it's not that Black or brown people are bad. There are certain people, part of the political machine, that have created an environment where they've taken advantage of the fact that Black and brown voters are not engaged in the process, and what they've done is they've made it easy to create a fraud around that. So let me tell you about my own experiences. In 2016 and before, we had a certain set of election laws that have since been changed in 2018 and 2020 in California. And obviously the changes in those laws have made it so we're now in mail-in ballots, and we were starting to do that in 2018, but we still had some voting centers open. And then our next election will actually be all mail-in without any voting centers, even where you can actually show up. But this window of opportunity that I've seen in 2018 and 2020 has allowed me to see some of the cracks in the system and definitely where fraud has occurred. But this fraud has started from a long, long time. LA County used to be a pretty swing red county, but has since shifted hard blue because I've seen city by city. We have lots of cities in the LA metro, a city by city fall. And once, the blues end up taking over a city, it makes it very easy for them to start, basically controlling a lot of the processes of how elections are run and creating little openings where fraud starts occurring. So I used to volunteer at a senior center, which also served as a precinct for elections. And what I noticed was, after 8 p.m. when the polls closed, there was wink, wink, nod, nod. We're going to get a lot of the people that didn't vote and fill out their ballots for them. So literally that happened. I've reported this. I've escalated this up to Secretary of State. Nothing has been done. Okay, now fast forward to 2018 when we started our first mail-in ballots, and it was part of the Democrats' push to take over Orange County and Southern California and get the remaining Congress seats. This was when I saw a massive amount of people starting to vote on election day, because before election day, Republicans were ahead by so many points, and then suddenly there's all these ballots that came in. It was shocking and it was unprecedented at the time. And I was helping the Young Kim campaign. She was the Republican running in the LA Orange County area. And I was at the Registrar of Voters, the 3 days after the election and when they were able to receive these ballots. And it was amazing how so many people that were working there were actively trying to hide things and trying to push us out. And basically, I got kicked out. They said I was making too much noise, pacing around. Of course, I'm going to pace around and look at, the signature verifications. Then let's really look at the signature verifications. So now with mail-in ballots, you're able to fill out these ballots and no one knows where it's coming from. Kind of like what one of the people earlier was saying, filling out something for a mom. You don't know. People can forge signatures very easily if they're able to just, look. It's easy to do that. And the verification was very lax and it's very inconsistent. So yes, there is a problem and it is widespread. And it has gotten widespread to a point in California where it makes a lot of conservatives have lost faith in elections. So yeah, this is a problem. And, I'll just end with that. It's, from this unique perspective, I can attest to you that there are major issues. And in fact, just last election, right after 2018, yeah, I'm wrapping up. There was a lawsuit to the Secretary of State that eventually was ruled in the favor of purging 900,000 voter registrations that were, people have moved, people have died, there are people that are 150 years old. I mean, 900,000 in LA County alone. So yeah, there is some effect on that.
Okay, thank you. And we will now go to questions. So I'm going to start with a panel question, and then we will go to Judy Kaz Doyle and Jennifer Bryan, assuming that you are in the room. So for our panelist question, we will go to Kim. You haven't spoken yet. Go ahead. Ask your question to me.
Madam Chairman, the speaker indicated that he witnessed individuals filling out ballots after the polls actually closed in California, if I understood him correctly. I'm curious, were these poll workers that completed these ballots?
Okay.
Poll
yes,
workers.
Poll workers. Okay, that were stacked. They're obviously for one party, and they were stacked, and it was a very coordinated effort. The people that signed up, it's like, overwhelmingly was for one party.
All right.
Okay, that was going to be my next question. So you
can have a follow-up.
Those poll workers. Yes, the speaker knows for sure the party that those poll workers were.
Yeah, Democrat.
Okay. Okay.
All right. All right. Good. So we'll now go to Jennifer Bryan. Go ahead and ask your question to me.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I've sort of forgotten how I worded my question, but it has to do with I understand our focus is on the voting itself. It feels to me like the manipulation of the process really begins with how much money is poured into elections. And so it feels, somebody said you have to trust the outcome. You have to have, if you're going to believe the results, you have to trust the process. But the process does seem highly corruptible if it is paid for with enormous sums of money. So I'm just curious about how the speaker or really any of the panelists might address
I'll
that.
answer the question.
Yeah.
Mr. Ang, go ahead.
Yeah, $30 million was poured into Orange County alone to get the 4 congressional districts that were Republican in 2018 that switched over to blue. That is the type of money that was able to fund this type of. So I completely agree with the questioner about that. Yeah, it's not a good thing, and unfortunately, it's how. It's the way of the world at this point, and I wish we could come together for a solution to stop big money from manipulating our elections. And that in California's case, the big money is from Democrats.
Alrighty, and then for our final question, we will go to Judy Kaz-Doyle. Judy, go ahead and ask your question to me.
Hi, my name's Judy, and my question is for most of the pro side so far, although not so much the most recent speaker. Most of the focus has been on the 2020 election. And I guess my question is for any of the pro side speakers, I would be interested in hearing what they have to say about fraud in other elections. Is this something that has been going on all along, despite the studies that were cited by the second speaker indicating that voter fraud was low? Or if that's not the case and that the fraud is mainly in the 2020 election, why did it spike at this time?
All right.
Oh, you know, to answer that, and obviously I kind of explained how LA County shifted red to blue, and I've seen increasing instances of a weak system being able to get more nefarious elements in to manipulate the elections. But really, let's look at overall, the election fraud has been going on for a long time now, especially in cities. In cities, there are just more people packed into one space, and more people that are actually apathetic about the process. So of course you're going to have some hardcores on the left and the right, and they may be more vocal and more visible in the city, but a majority of people are registered and they do not vote. That's why we have our DMV registering anyone, regardless of citizenship status, to become voters right away. They're trying to get like 100% registration, and LA County, for example, has 125% registration over eligible voters. Things like that is, it's a clear example that there's something very, very broken in the system, and it's been going on for a while to get to that 125% or 150% in certain counties. I mean, Orange County this last election supposedly had 90% turnout. I find that crazy. I mean, in the state, what is it? In the country, it was 60%, 70% turnout, but 90% is pretty overboard. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. All right, and with that, Mr. Ang is thanked.
Thank you.
Jazz hands for Mr. Ang. Yes, absolutely. So we're going to take a brief pause now, and before we go to our next speech, and do a poll. And this is a chance for all of you attendees, and actually panelists, you can participate in it too, to weigh in on what you would like to see discussed in the rest of the debate. So Cliff, if you go ahead and launch the poll. Everyone, you have 1 minute to fill it out. All right, so we'll share these results with all of you. Very good. So in terms of what folks would like to see discussed in the rest of the debate, there's a lot of interest in evidence or proof of voter fraud and specific changes that it could improve things, voter suppression, and restoring and maintaining trust in our democracy. So panelists, that is just some feedback for you on what listeners would like to hear. And it's actually great that we're talking about some of the specifics, because Kim Watson, I know you can speak to that. So for our next negative speech, go ahead. You have 4 minutes.
Thanks, April. Thanks, everyone. I'm a seasoned worker here at our local county board of elections here in Ohio. So I'm going to speak to only my experience working in my county, but every county here in Ohio is a little bit different. But pretty much we all have to follow the same processes set down by the Secretary of State. So I tell my friends, I get to see how the sausage is made. Most people have no idea of all the checks and balances that are involved in voting. And it's actually crazy amount of work involved in processing mail-in ballots. In Ohio, our early voting starts a month before the election, and our mail-in ballot process starts a month before the election. And in our county, over 50% of the voters voted early. So that's not even counting on election day. It is actually really hard to commit fraud. In Ohio, there's very little evidence of voter fraud. What I see is a lot of voter confusion and misinformation. So let me give you just a quick overview of the steps involved in processing a mail-in ballot. And again, this is for Ohio. First, we have to get a request from the voter, and that request has to include certain identifiable information and a signature. And we match all of that against our database. And there's a whole thing about the signatures, and I don't have enough time to go into that. Most people do an excellent job of matching what we have on file. And that information, after we validate it, if it doesn't match, it goes to another team to follow up with the voter. But once it's validated, then we have a second person who has to enter that request into our voter database. And then a third person who audits the report to make sure that all of that information was entered in correctly. Now, every ballot has a unique number printed on the bottom of the ballot. And that number is captured in our voter database and associated with that voter. So we know what ballot we issued that voter. Before the ballot is even mailed, we check it again to make sure that that ballot we're sending matches our database. When the voter sends that ballot back, it's in a sealed envelope and it has the identifiable information and the signature. We go through the whole verification process all over again. And only after everything is verified do we open up that ballot. And here in Ohio, it has to be in the presence of a person from both parties. And we look at that number on that ballot and validate that that is the same ballot we sent the voter. Now, if it's not the same, it gets sent over to another team for investigation. That rarely ever happens. So after we get that ballot, we do that verification, we tear that little number off the bottom of the ballot, and then that ballot gets scanned. Now we have no idea who that ballot is associated with because the number's been removed. So all of that work that I just described takes an incredible number of man hours to complete. And I think it was Pennsylvania that couldn't even begin that verification process until after the polls closed. So it's not surprising at all to me why it took so long for some states to finalize their election results. We were able to do this in Ohio all along, once we received the ballot, could do all this verification. We didn't have to wait until the day that the polls closed. Also during this election cycle, because of all the mistrust people had and the confusion and fear about mail-in ballots, we would get people coming into the Board of Elections all the time who would say they got their mail-in ballot, but they didn't want to use it, or they threw it away, or they didn't trust the post office or whatever, and they wanted to vote in person. So in that case, we actually have to invalidate their mail-in ballot and issue a new ballot to them. So if that person would come to the polls and vote, and then we would, subsequently receive their mail-in ballot, we wouldn't count it because it's already been invalidated in our system. And in fact, we had very few instances where we had someone who voted and also sent in a mail-in ballot. If that happened, it gets turned over to the director for investigation. And ultimately, those go to the county prosecutor's office for further follow-up to see if there was actually fraud committed. And as I said, it happened very rarely. And I'm not saying that mistakes don't happen. As other speakers have said, this is not a perfect system. It can be improved. But having worked at the Board of Elections and seen all of the checks and balances and audits, and there's audits and audits and audits, I really have a very high confidence level in the election process and in the voting process. And I don't think fraud is rampant or a big problem. I do think we do need to do a better job of educating voters on how the process works. Thank you.
All right. So we're going to go to jazz hands. Absolutely. Sorry, I forgot for Kim. Yeah. So panel question first, and then a couple attendee questions. So for the panel question, we'll go to Shovik Banerjee. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Yeah, thank you to the speaker. I was really interested in the detailed and specific explanation of mail-in voting, because I think it's quite remarkable how well the country does it from what I've read. And I was really worried when the post office started dismantling the mail sorters in August. And I was wondering, as someone who looks so closely at process, how were you reacting to that? How were your how was the speaker? Yeah, how was she reacting to that, and how were other people working on the operations of elections on both sides reacting to that? Because there was a lot of suspicion around 10 to 20% of American mail sorters were being dismantled.
Right. Well, certainly there was a lot of, people started panicking when all of this was hitting the news. Their ballot would not make it to the Board of Elections on time, right? And so subsequent, as a result of that, we just had hordes of people coming in that we went through all of this work to mail them a ballot. And then they said, I'm fearful it won't get here on time, or, it'll get thrown away, or whatever whatever. I don't, it's not trustworthy. So certainly that impacted a lot of people, and many folks who probably would have voted by mail then wound up not doing that and coming in.
All right. Excellent.
And just real quick, another problem is also postmarking mail, right? So at least again here in Ohio, we'll accept ballots for X number of days after the election if they're postmarked by, I think it's actually by the day before the election. And if that mail's not postmarked for whatever reason, then that is a problem and it can't get counted, and that disenfranchises people.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we will now move on to attendee questions, and I'm going to start with one for someone who I think actually may not be here, or at least may not be able to speak, just looking at the text. So, but it's an important question. So Maxim Shrogan asks, is it okay to bend the rules because of COVID? I.e., is it true that Pennsylvania rules were changed judicially, not by the legislature, which is not in conformity with federal mandates? Can this sort of thing be justified by COVID?
Well, I can't speak to Pennsylvania because I'm in Ohio. I'm trying to think of certainly the Secretary of State probably changed some procedural rules for the boards of election because of COVID. I can't think of something specifically, but again, there's a lot of procedures, right, involved in the whole verification process or whatever it is having to do with voting. And so I do believe the Secretary of State does have power to make changes as needed.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, we had a case here in Ohio that our primary in March was canceled literally the night before the primary. I was supposed to work. My husband was supposed to work. We found out 11:30 at night. Yes. Oh. At 11:30 at night that we weren't going to have a primary at 6:30 the next morning. And that was actually done by the Department of Health because of COVID, because it was March 19th, I think. So, and then it turned into all mail-in voting. So, yes.
All righty. I'd like to call on Steve Testa. And there are several Steves here, so I think I've enabled you to speak. Steve Testa, go ahead and unmute yourself if you can and ask your question to me. All right. I swear there are like 25 Steves in this room. So I think I'm actually just going to read this one as well. So Steve Testa asks, Madam Chair, thank you. My concern, Steve, is that I've heard many solutions to this issue of fraud and or access, that often the solution seems to be to nationalize the process of voting. My experience, speaking as Steve, in my hometown is that most elections are run very well with little complaint. When we speak of trust in the system and each other, isn't each community the best way to build trust and therefore believable results? Go ahead, Kim.
I agree that elections should be kept local. I do find it odd that for such an important part of our, democracy, that literally, at least again in Ohio, every county can kind of do it differently. There's certain, overall rules that they have to follow, but they can have different voting machines. They can have, they can't have different hours. But, if you think about it, I do think there does need to be some minimum level that is set nationally. And then every, locality, whether it be on a county level or a state level, can have changes to that best suits the citizens in their geographic area. That's my personal opinion.
All right. And with that, Ms. Watson is thanked. Jazz hands for Kim one more time. Yes, very good. All right, so now we will go to our next speech in the affirmative, Mr. Steve House. Go ahead, Steve, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just under 160,000 votes total in Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Wisconsin, or approximately 0.098%, decided the election. My fellow Americans, the reason why this is so important is because 244 years ago, a group of patriots sat in a room considering mutiny against the government because they did not have the right to choose their leaders. They didn't have the right to vote. Boxes got thrown into the Boston Harbor. A war was started. More than 20,000 Americans died fighting for the right to vote. Who would lead them? Who would help? Who they would have to answer to in raising their families and doing what they thought was best. The more that government has creeped into our lives, the less we trust it, and the more election integrity becomes important to all of us. Fast forward to today. Americans still want the right to vote for who leads them. Hopefully we won't see 20,000 people die over what happened in the 2020 election, but we can't ignore the fact that many believe it contained a significant amount of voter fraud. I use the word significant for a reason. This issue isn't just about the presidential election, and my fear in listening to those supporting the negative is that they're focused only on the presidential election itself. They said voter fraud is done at such a small rate, it doesn't affect the outcomes of elections. Consider 3 election contests for Congress in 2020. Marion Miller Meeks in Iowa Congressional District 2 won her election by 6 votes out of 400,000 cast. Claudia Tenney in New York's number 2 won her congressional seat by 109 votes out of 312,000 cast. And Mark Garcia won a seat in California by 333 votes out of 339,000 votes cast. So close in those first 2 cases, they're considered to have a margin of victory of 0%. These are just 3 congressional races. In a Mississippi City Council race, it was proven that 78% of certified absentee ballots were fraudulent, and a woman is going to go to jail over it because she manufactured votes that weren't real. I ask you, should a town council candidate in Addison, Michigan, be denied the right to hold office just because the level of election fraud is too small to do anything about? Guess what? On the stock market in the US, we make more than 200 million trades in a month. The 2020 election saw 160 million votes. How do we use computers to accurately make 200 million trades every month, and we can't count 160 million votes accurately once every 4 years? Was there voter fraud in the 2020 election? I have no doubt. Did it impact races around the country? Yes, in my opinion, it sure did. My definition of voter fraud or election integrity also includes voter suppression. I simply want to see us get this right. When you have margins of victory of a few hundred votes out of 400,000, it matters whether we get voting right. Every person who can legally vote in this country should have that right and a method to do it. It's not acceptable to solve voter suppression problems by allowing for more voter fraud. We have the most experienced mail-in ballot voting system in the country in Colorado. Over a period of about 5 elections, we learned that the biggest problem was mailing ballots to inactive voters. Why? Because those ballots ended up in the garbage, or, as proven by Project Veritas, some of those ballots were harvested and voted. The inactive voter would have never known, and the ballot would be counted anyway. There are good ways for inactive voters to get their ballots and great risk of fraud in just mailing to everyone. How many states in this country during this election, for the first time, mailed ballots to everyone in their state, whether they were active or not, and what happened to those ballots. The Harvard Election Integrity Project did an extensive review of election integrity in the US. They used a 100-point system with 100 being perfect. 27 states were rated below 80% and no state was above 90. This is a whole bunch of B's and C's on election integrity. Voting rights are a primary reason why we don't speak with a British accent. I don't think we can afford to be 20th out of 27 high-performing democracies in the world on election integrity. That's where we are right now. If we don't get this right, we will likely go back to being a place where people aren't led by those who they believe in, and maybe even worse, they won't have the opportunity to vote at all. I'm going to close with this. I can't explain, nor can almost anyone explain, why on election night, several critical battleground states, including Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia, stopped counting votes about the exact same time, and Trump was leading in all of them. When they started counting again, the margin of votes for Joe Biden was beyond the statistically possible in most analysts' minds, and those states flipped for Biden. I don't know if it was possible or not, but I can't shake the concern that I don't have an answer as to why vote counting stopped in only those few critical swing states and nowhere else, and why at the same exact time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, jazz hands for Mr. House. Yeah, wonderful. So for our panelist question, we'll go to Ms. Blossomgame. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to ask our speaker that just spoke what the 2 or 3 key things are that our speaker believes should be done in order to rectify the situation as he sees it.
All right.
My answer, and that's a great question, would be in some places in this country, we don't have the technology to do it right. You know, is it possible we need to go to the ink on your finger method that we see when I visit Africa and see voters voting in Africa? The bottom line is establishing someone's ID. And quite frankly, the problem I have with voter suppression, Brenda, is that there are many places.
Talk to me, but go ahead.
Madam Speaker, or Madam Chair, the problem I have is in places like Ward 1 in Aurora, Colorado, there are many people there that do not have an ID. They don't have access to an ID. But that's not an acceptable answer for them or for the voting system. We need to figure that out. There are ways to know who is where and get that done. And unfortunately, we don't usually attempt to fix it until after the election's over, and that's a mistake.
All right, so for attendee questions, we're going to start with Andrea Barron. Andrea, go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. My question, Madam Chair, for the speaker is, Donald Trump won the 2016 election because of 77,000 votes in 3 swing states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Do you think that Trump was elected?
Does he think? Mm-hmm.
Do you think that Trump was
elected?
Does
he think? Sorry, you have to say it to me. Does the speaker think? Go ahead.
Does the speaker think that Trump was elected because of a fraudulent election and that Hillary Clinton should have become president?
I think that's a great question. And neither I nor virtually anyone knows. And that's part of the problem. We need to make sure that we don't have 0.098% voter fraud. We need to make sure we don't have 1% voter fraud. We need to make sure that the things we've seen people do, ballot after ballot after ballot, having no folds, they're questions for us. So I can't answer what happened in 2016, and I don't know the whole truth about 2020. I'm concerned about it, but what I do know is we have to make sure we're never asking this question again.
Sure, sounds good to me. Let's now go to Randy Linville. Go ahead and ask your question to me. You're muted, Randy, and I can't unmute you. Gotta unmute yourself. All right, this is our final question. So, Randy, I'll give you 1 more minute to try to unmute. And okay, if that's not working, I will read the question. It is, how is it explained that the alleged fraud was disproportionately against Trump, but not against the down ballot Republicans?
That's a great question too. You know, as someone who has watched what's going on, you know, I've seen the videos, I've talked to people because I was a poll watcher, I was an election judge, about how many ballots there were that had only one radio button checked, and that was the presidential race itself. That happened in a lot of states. Do I know that it didn't impact down ballot Republicans? I don't know that it didn't impact down ballot Republicans. I cited for you the fact that there were 2 races, congressional races, decided by less than 112 votes combined. Who knows what happened in those races? And I feel for the candidates. When you run as a candidate, which I have done, if you lose an election by 9 votes or 109 votes, your supporters, your family, and everybody else is dealing with that reality that you've been beaten by such a close margin. You have to hope, and I'd like you to believe, that that was the true outcome of the race, but I can't assure you of that based on what I've seen in election integrity issues around the country.
All right, and with that, Mr. House is thanked. Jazz hands for Mr. House. All right, so our final negative speaker for this round is Shovik Banerjee. And before you kick off, Shovik, I just want to remind panelists that after this, we're going to a sort of lightning round where each of you will have 2 minutes to just share responses from that have come to mind over the course of the debate. And we'll be going in reverse order, starting with Steve and then Shovik. All right, Shovik, let's hear your 4 minutes. Go ahead.
Sure. So was voter fraud a big problem in 2020? If we are to bridge the divide, we have to start from a common ground and have mutual faith, a mutual faith effort to seek truth. We have to look at Trump's very specific claims. We've heard a lot of, I think, anecdotes today, but Trump made very specific claims that we haven't even really addressed today. So I think we should look at those, but in a fair, transparent way. So I want to first tell you how a team of volunteers that worked with AverPoint evaluated his claims, discuss how he advanced his voter fraud message, and finally suggest a better way to achieve election integrity, which is, I think, what we all want. So at AverPoint, we're trying to develop a community review system for digital content. Here's how it works. Instead of a single fact check, multiple people can review a claim. When you review, you decide if there's sufficient evidence to prove the claim, and you explain your decision either way, and you provide links to your sources. Pretty simple. For now, we don't limit what source you can use, but we encourage primary sources. And we don't currently aggregate the reviews into an overall score. So we just kind of let you see what different people find. This doesn't lead to agreement, and I don't think it can, but it helps both sides show their evidence and engage with the other side's evidence. So we asked volunteers to use this process to evaluate Trump's January 6th speech, where he made, by our count, 56 very specific claims about voter fraud. And he used these claims to demand Vice President Pence reject the electoral votes from 5 swing states. Volunteers tried to verify the claims. And again, we're encouraged to go beyond like the first fact check on Google and look at the primary sources. State and local election officials, state judges, US Supreme Court, Justice Department, Department of Homeland Security. And so far, the volunteers were not able to verify Trump's claims. And I'd like to welcome others to give that a try. But let me give you an example of what happened. So Trump said in Pennsylvania, you had 205,000 more ballots than voters. He then called that a mathematical impossibility. But this accusation, you can go back, started in November when a state senator and Rudy Giuliani said 1.8 million ballots were sent out, 2.6 million ballots came back. Now, election officials, journalists quickly pointed out that 1.8 million ballots were sent out, but for the primary. 3 million ballots were sent out for the general. Now, we're all moving fast, tempers are high. So you could just say, look, my bad, guys, I got this one wrong. But he kept repeating the claim through November, December, up to the infamous speech. He ignored the counter evidence. Now, we saw a similar pattern about claims about dead voters, non-citizens, duffel bags, late votes, and more. And so now let's go beyond these 56 very specific claims. I want to cite 5 facts that I think are very important to this whole discussion. The charge of voter fraud was a very effective fundraising message. It raised over $200 million. He took that and he spent 50 million of it on social media and TV, cementing the idea of voter fraud in the consciousness. He only spent 10 million on legal fees investigating it, trying to prove it. And there was a big gap between what was said publicly and what was actually said in court. And many lawyers, even staunch Trump backers, refused to take these cases. 61 of 62 lawsuits failed. And judges did look at the evidence and said it wasn't enough to even do the case. Many Trump allies, including Bill Barr and Mitch McConnell, said there's not evidence of widespread fraud. So all of this makes me doubt that this charge came from a place of integrity. It created doubts in the minds of voters, but was it based on persuasive evidence? So is the problem with vote fraud or the use of rumors and false information to create doubt? So if we want to take common action to increase election integrity, what I'd like is both sides to really go to these specific claims that Trump made. Look at the verifiable evidence from a range of sources, use the sources you want, and explain whether you think the claim has merit. Again, I don't think this is going to change minds, but it might get us past fuzzy rumors. And it would show good faith effort to find the truth. If you want to review Trump's claims, you could send me your email in the chat. I'd love to engage with you from both sides. And if I saw that good faith among citizens, I'd see value in what's been mentioned, like a formal bipartisan commission. But if I don't see that happening, I don't see how a commission, a new voting machine, or some camera is going to change the willingness to believe unproven or disproven rumor. Because then the problem is not a lack of integrity in the election. It's a lack of integrity in the accusation. Thank you.
All right, and we'll go to questions. Yes, jazz hands for Mr. Banerjee. Yeah, very good. Start with a panel question, if there is one. All right. Let's go then. Oh, Paul Norris, go ahead. You're muted, sir.
I wasn't sure which hand I was supposed to raise, the electronic hand or the other hand. So, and I'm formulating my question as I sit here, but it's like, so it's about, is this actually all about Trump? And I'll just say that I get that I frankly I believe I understand how badly so many people wanted to get rid of Trump. I get that. But if we set aside Trump himself and Trump's accusations and his techniques, I would ask the speaker, is there not anything left that's worth looking at?
I think I understand the question. Yes, if we first could admit that, hey, let's go through 56 claims made by the President of the United States, very specific numbers, states, vivid images, and if we could say that if we could look at the evidence for it, because no one's going to take my view on it, right? I kind of want everyone to go through this process themselves. If everyone goes through that process, I think that's the first step to healing, because yes, I do agree that I firmly believe in election integrity, doing everything we can to keep it secure on both issues, fraud and suppression. But I think the bigger elephant in the room and what's really hurting our country is these sets of claims have just entered the consciousness from Trump. I don't think we can just kind of, so yes, in theory, if we took Trump away in theory, yes, we could have this very technical, specific question about better ways to verify. But that is the elephant in the room right now. And I don't think a Republican's going to believe a Democrat's review of the evidence and vice versa. So I would just like to see at a popular level, people go through that.
All right. And for attendee questions, we're going to start with Elliot Rice. Elliot, go ahead and ask your question to me.
All right. I hope you can hear me. Fraud is one thing. What about violations of the U.S. Constitution that grants power to the state legislatures to write the election laws, not governors, judges, or secretaries of state? Ohio follows the law and it works. Their results were known by 11 p.m.
I think, yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, if you're asking in theory, yeah, I think.
He's asking.
Excuse me?
He's asking, just making sure it's the third person. If he's asking in theory, go ahead.
Yeah, yes, he's asking in theory, yeah, like violating Constitution, of course, that's never something I'd support. The allegation refers to Pennsylvania, I believe, where the state Supreme Court ruled that the ballots can't be rejected for signature verification, and there was a whole thing between the Supreme Court, the state legislature, the Secretary of State, and I think, you know, that particular issue, Trump was saying that the state constitution was being violated. I think the other side is saying no. The Secretary of State said, no, we have an election code that was created by the legislature, which does not require us to do signature verification. And the Supreme Court favored the Secretary of State. So again, I would encourage you to look at the evidence and what both sides said, but it's not as simple as the Constitution was being violated.
And for a final question, we'll go to David Klein. David, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question to me.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to know what the speaker thinks could be changed in US elections in order to increase everybody's confidence in their integrity. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. And again, I mean, where I'm coming from and why I'm doing what I'm doing, I think the first step is we need to increase trust in information in this country. There are agents of disinformation who they use social media, they figure out your biases, they tell you things, it spreads. Memes are spreading more information than actual experts and credible sources. And I don't think a commission of experts, even if they find a bunch of recommendations, is going to change that underlying loss of faith in information. So my view is we can't fix information top down, and we need some kind of community, agreed upon community rules, something like Wikipedia that lets us look at a claim in a video, in text, and there's a set of rules that both sides can kind of say, okay, we'll work with this. This is better than not having it.
All right, and with that, Mr. Banerjee is thanked. Jazz hands, yes, absolutely. So now we come to the final and more and very exciting portion of the night, where we are going to have our lightning round of response speeches. So each of you will have up to 2 minutes, and I'm going to be a little bit stricter on time because we're coming close to the end here, to give your responses. And I would just remind all the panelists to, so we're going to go in reverse order, and I would remind everybody that think of it as though y'all are the only people in the room, and you're trying to convince someone who believes news sources and listens to things that you don't trust, right? Because ultimately some of this is about trust. And so I would like to, Mr. Kulkarni, we're going in reverse order. Do you have a question?
It's a process question.
Okay, on order, yep.
Could you give us some kind of nonverbal cue, like 30 seconds before it's over, or like a minute 30 in, or is that too hard?
Sure. I will pick up my gavel and do this when you have 30 seconds left.
Much obliged, Madam Chair.
Absolutely. All right. And so we will start with Mr. House. We have 2 minutes to respond to the other folks here and everything that's been said.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to address 3 things that I think are important. Number one, there are 11,000 people who signed 500 affidavits saying that they witnessed voter fraud. Having been someone who stood in a room and watched what happens in the voting process, I understand their point of view. And just as my friend Silas pointed out, I don't think we should be accusing people of being liars or cheaters. I think we need to investigate those 11,000 people's claims in detail, which I do not believe has happened. Number 2, I think we have to define what voter fraud is. So there's plenty of different things that can happen in a voting process, from somebody voting the wrong ballot, somebody not signing a ballot, because we saw lots of unsigned ballots get counted, ballots being distributed too late or being received too late on the part of the counting center. There's many, many other categories we need to find that. And thirdly, I think we need to approach the idea that if we can use biometrics to distribute medical class narcotics to patients when they have pharmacy requirements, why can't we consider biometric voting identification with a fingerprint, with an eye? I know that we have the systems out there to do that because I've been an IT person my entire life. I think we need to consider that possibility in how we vote. And we may have to slow down the counting process a little bit. I don't believe it's necessary for the media and for all of us to absolutely know or try to know who the president is or who the elected officials are the night of the election. If it takes too long to count accurately, then give it more time. It's too important that we get this right. We've been around for 244 years. The average democracy lasts 250 years. If we don't do something, we will decay our way out of the representative republic that I love so much. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
right, and with that, Mr. House is thanked. Yes, jazz hands, absolutely. So we will now go to Mr. Banerjee. You have 2 minutes. Go ahead. You muted. There we go.
Yeah. So thank you. I want to thank the panelists. I think this is so important to hear through the lens of all sides, and I'm learning a lot. I just spoke like 2 minutes ago. So I think the main point I'm going to repeat something, but I am so concerned that as a Democrat, I've seen, Obama released his birth certificate and didn't change anyone's mind. The Mueller investigation found over 100 contacts between Russia and the Trump campaign, and it was called no collusion. It was a witch hunt. There is a feeling on my side that investigations and commissions are just going to, if they find anything against Trump, it's going to be dismissed as radical left, rhinos, fake news media, deep state, whatever. So what I really want to think about, and what I've been trying to think about, is how can we fairly, in a bipartisan way, at a popular level, and commissions at an elite level, at a popular level, how do we agree that, hey, this amount of evidence is kind of like what is the threshold for us to be convinced? Because my feeling is I can't really convince someone who looks at a birth certificate and still doesn't believe it. So that is, I think, to me, bigger issue than the specific technical fixes. And I would be very curious to hear, especially from the Republican side, like, hey, this is what would convince us, and these is kind of set of rules that we could work with.
All right, excellent. With that, Mr. Banerjee is thanked. Jazz hands, yes. We will now go to Mr. Eng. 2 minutes for your responses.
Yeah, I really want to kind of highlight, I really appreciated Kim's explanation of, it's important we get in the weeds. I think a lot of people in political discourse want to just be in the high level and not actually go down to the mechanics of what goes on with elections. And, I want to praise Ohio for actually having a very good process. And obviously a lot of states that went red this last time, they were able to count their votes on election night. And we got to go back to that. I want to reiterate, what's happened in the community with, especially last election, definitely much higher than in 2018. But I still heard a lot in 2018 where I have a lot of people in the community that have come up to me and gone, is it weird that when I went into the voting center that they said I already voted and gave me a provisional? Is it weird that my registration got switched from Republican to independent or Republican to Democrat? And, all these things really kind of just make me concerned. And, I think that we need to keep, trying to have integrity down to the mechanical level. And if we don't, and we just accept, I don't like that I heard, oh, we just accept, yeah, fraud just happens. No, there's ways to control that. There's ways to actually check voter ID, which is the biggest thing. People are not, especially when you do mail ballots, anyone can be filling those out. Dead people can be voting as long as it gets to your household. People who have moved, I was receiving ballots from, people that have already moved. I mean, this is crazy. California is probably the biggest example of that being a runaway train and things going out of control. But I already started seeing that last election with Pennsylvania switching their rules midstream. I mean, that to me is also another big issue that was not really talked about today. You cannot. Yeah.
We're about out of time.
Yeah, just switch midstream. So thank you.
All right. Very good. That Mr. Angus thanked. Jazz hands. Yes, definitely. Okay. Next we will go to Kim, Ms. Watson. 2 minutes responses.
A couple of things I wanted to say. I heard Mark and another speaker or questioner say something about Ohio counted all their ballots, by election night. Actually, that's not true. Certainly the vast majority are counted because all the early voting is completed and, the people who show up at the polls that day. But we actually have 10 days post-election to count all the ballots because you still have mail-in ballots coming in for several days that are postmarked before the election. Those have to get opened up and validated and counted. And then we have, a lot of provisional. And so, those are ballots that somebody has presented at, usually at the polling location. They say they live there, they want to vote. But for whatever reason, they can't, we can't verify them in our poll book. We thought we mailed them a mail-in ballot. We can't verify they live where they live, et cetera. There's lots of reasons. And all of the, so post-election, all of that has to get counted. And depending on, especially again, in this last county, when the turnout, our county, the turnout was 82%. And that we weren't the highest county in the state. So it takes, quite a bit of time to complete all of this. But the other thing I wanted to say real quick is whether or not you think the election process is secure or fraught with fraud, go be a poll worker. I mean, it is a rewarding experience. You will learn a lot. It will help educate you, and then you really will have a much better appreciation of flaws and the securities in place. So anyway, that's my little thing for civic duty. Go be a poll worker.
All right, very good. We second that, and with that, Kim Watson is thanked. Jazz hands for Ms. Watson. Yes, good. All right. Thanks, Chris. So next, we'll go to Paul Norris. Paul, 2 minutes of responses.
Oh, well, I'd like to start out by saying that, when we're looking at a mixture of tribalism and desire to actually serve the common good, I think it's really important to have our eyes open to both of those components. And I say, see it all, but feed the good. And I just like to add to that, so we hear a lot about Trump, and I just want to say, for me, this is not about Trump. I never, I have supported him, but I never believed what he said. I don't believe what Democrats say. I don't believe what Republicans say. I don't believe any single source. I don't even believe the sources in Braver Angels. I like to put it all together from a mixture. And, I was noticing as I worked on my speech, I found myself becoming less partisan. And began to see it as more and more of a systems problem, and just recognize human nature for what it is and create a system that deals with human nature in its not always so pretty realities. Just a couple of notes, something I read recently that just really struck me. People don't write in cursive anymore. Well, guess what? If you don't write in cursive, you can't really have a verifiable signature. Block printing is so much easier to defraud. And that just really struck me. It's like, wow, yeah, how about that? I want to divert a little bit. I want to say one of the major disasters, I think, in US history was passing campaign finance reform. Not because campaign finance reform was a bad idea, but because human beings twisted it to serve their own purposes. And it locked in the two-party system. And the way the two-party system is locked in is really hurting us right now. Right. 2 more points. If I hear that a study said something, I don't believe a thing unless it was reviewed by somebody from the other side to see if there were holes you could put a truck through. And one last sentence, I just got to say this. Okay, a lie will be halfway around the world before truth puts its boots on.
Okay, and with that, Mr. Norris is thanked. Jazz hands. All right, Mr. Kulkarni, your 2 minutes of responses.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So a couple responses. Mr. Iwinski said, there have been no subpoenas, no people under oath. That's because the people who make a lot of claims and are willing to make claims on the camera or in social media aren't willing to say it in court. So they throw it out because there's no witnesses. Do you want an example of that? Look at the media sources like Fox News that walked back their claims about voting machines being fraudulent after Dominion filed a lawsuit where they would have had to stick up for those claims in court. Because it's real easy to say a lie on social media. It's much harder to say a lie in court. So if there's nobody willing to testify in court, maybe that's because there's nobody who actually has evidence that could really stand up in court. Second, I just want to encourage our audience not to take the quote unquote middle ground on this. because don't think that election integrity is like the consensus position here. There is a real trade-off between preventing voter fraud and protecting voter rights. You make it harder to vote. You make it harder to check, make it really hard to check and make sure exactly somebody's name is there. A lot of people who have the legitimate right to vote are going to be held out. And you make it easier to vote, and some people who don't have the right to vote will vote. So you have to ask which problem is big and which problem is not big. So yes, voter fraud is possible, but that doesn't mean it's common. It's less than 1 in 100,000. And halfway between taking away voting rights and not taking away voting rights is taking away some people's voting rights. That's the problem that's real. That's a problem that's large. Voting rights it's true. It's very small. Last thing I'll say, if you want to know evidence on this point about voter suppression, which I think is the real issue here, look at the links that I've asked them to chat for me. I've written about this before. It's been written about otherwise. Just take one example, North Carolina, they targeted African-American voters with almost surgical precision. That's what a court found in North Carolina.
All right. And with that, Mr. Kulkarni is thanked. Jazz hands. Yes. Good. All right. Mr. Iwinski, 2 minutes of response.
Well, there's been a lot of ground covered tonight. And interestingly, when a claim is made, a refutation can also be made about nitpicking or taking one example and saying, well, what about this? That doesn't cover the totality of the claims. And as far as it not being a big issue, I did a little research. You can find it on Wikipedia. A U.S. Senate seat from New Hampshire, 2-vote margin. A House seat from Iowa, 6-vote margin. A New York House seat, 1-vote margin. These are not all this year. But the slightest bit of fraudulence, and in an election year where House and Senate may be so balanced, where a Senate that goes one way, all of a sudden that moves the whole legislative process. So one vote moves one. I would also say that, you know, I'm really frustrated about this constant reiteration of Trump's a liar. Hey, he's a media star and a New York real estate entrepreneur. Is not hyperbole to be expected. Of course it is. And so Trump says there was 300,000 or something, and someone says, well, we couldn't find 300,000. He's a liar. Come on, folks. The reality is that the information about fact checking him often itself is suppressed. I had 3,000 Twitter followers a month before the election. I'm down to 1,800s. And Twitter is wiping out conservatives, dropping their numbers and banning them for no reason. This prevents me from being a fact checker on reality. So I think it's not just an issue of proving Trump's a liar and that settles the case and we don't have to discuss this anymore. We must discuss it. And we can't fix every single element of a politician being in hyperbole. We can fix a process that gives us a closer approximation to fairness and integrity.
All right. With that, Mr. Iwinski is thanked. Jazz hands, right on time, sir. Well done. And for our final 2-minute response of the evening, Brenda Blassingame, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When I was in my 20s, I met a lawyer from the ACLU. And my question to that lawyer was, why do you defend people that spout racist, anti-Semitic things? And his response to me was that I defend them and their right to speak, so you have your right to speak. I really believe that we have to protect everyone's right to vote. The most important thing to me is that every single person in our country has the right to vote. It is protected and secured because people, my family died for my right to vote. Election integrity has to be our highest priority if we're going to preserve and sustain our republic and our belief in a democracy. Country above party. We have to be vigilant in ensuring our voting system can be trusted by all of us. And when I say all of us, I mean every single one of us, those on the right, those on the left, and those anywhere else. That is the most important thing we have to do.
All right. And with that, Ms. Blassingame is thanked. Jazz hands. Yes. Excellent. All right, so hang in there with me for another few minutes. Now is the part where we're going to open up the chat again, and I'd like everybody to answer 2 questions, or if you want to, which are think back on the last couple hours of discussion. I think this has been excellent, and I'd love for you to tell us to answer these 2 questions. And panelists, you get to answer these too. You can in just a second, I'll ask you to raise your hands, and we'll go down the list. What did you learn tonight, and what did you most enjoy? Alrighty, panelists, go ahead and raise your hand when you have an answer to one or both of those questions. And folks, feel free to put this in the chat. You can just raise your hand visually, that's fine. David.
Well, what I learned is that the issue of suppression is completely integral to the issue of fraud, and they have to be addressed simultaneously and systemically. And what I enjoyed is a passionate debate on an extremely volatile topic with courtesy, with kindness, and with thoughtfulness. And that gives me hope that we can take this wider message to a lot of people that right now are very volatile when they're not in a Braver's Angel kind of meeting.
All right, very good. Yeah, agree. I'd encourage y'all to look at the chat. It's really good. Steve, what did you learn and what did you enjoy?
I think the thing I learned the most is that we have to get this fixed. There's just there's no measure, no margin for error on this. A country is dependent upon its people's right to choose who leads them and live free. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. And I think that was really, really important. And I do think that there was a lot of agreement between the 2 sides on the issues that need to be resolved, and maybe a few different answers on how to do it. So let's get it worked out.
All right, great. Other panelists, what you learned and what you enjoyed. Alice.
I learned that the local story and the national story are not the same story, and that focusing all our attention on national issues instead of attending to the issues at the local level sometimes obscures what's really important to people or what's really motivating them. And I enjoyed Mr. Iwinski's speech, which was probably the most directly opposed to mine. And I enjoyed it because, he's humanizing somebody for me. He's humanizing a whole set of people who feel the way he feels. And I respect the guy, and I like what he had to say, even though I really disagree at a hardcore level. And that means something to me.
Wonderful. Brenda.
So what I learned is that the voting system that we have in this country is only as good as its weakest link, and that it's done differently everywhere. And we have to address that, and we have to come up with a set of ways of doing this that are equalizing and grounded in our shared interest for everyone. And what I most enjoyed was the civility of dialogue from different vantage points. Thank God for that, really.
Wonderful. Yes. All right. Not everybody has to go, but Paul, go ahead.
For me, they're one and the same. It's just how I continually marvel about how it seems, that we live on separate planets, and yet we can still somehow visit and communicate with each other.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Anyone else who wants to say something? Mark, and then I'll come to you, Shovik. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was very interested to hear the Blues are really focused on the, ability to make voting available to everyone, which I believe in that too. But I think that there needs to be a process, and if that process isn't followed, it's ripe for fraud, and that's what we have in California. So I share the sentiment. I think we're just going about it in different ways.
Wonderful. Yeah. Cheers. Shovik, go ahead.
Yeah. So this was my first Braver Angel debate.
Woohoo! Welcome.
Thank you. I've watched a few videos, but I think the I've been working on this problem of trust and dialogue at a more technical level. And I think the way the face-to-face, the community, the smiles, the human element of it, really, I enjoyed that. And especially during COVID, it was, I really appreciate and thank all of you for that, especially on the Republican side, because I live in Santa Monica and I don't interact with enough people on the other side. So I really appreciate that. The other thing I learned was it wasn't just that we're looking at this, Republican, Democrat, or suppression versus fraud. There's also a set of people that think in terms of, I think policy wonks tend to think statistics, national trends. And I was really interested at those of you who've worked locally and have local stories. And I think there's something about how you extrapolate your local experience and how the top-down people need to make their views more detailed. It feels like there's something to be learned in connecting those two ways of looking at the problem.
Excellent. Yeah, and for my part, I'll just say that I learned a lot throughout this debate, just about the substance and also about the very legitimate points that are on all sort of facets of this question. And I really enjoyed, I will admit, I was a little nervous coming into this debate because, like I said, there has been backlash aplenty about the fact that we're having it and from both sides on this question. And so I just enjoyed you all. I enjoyed the way that everybody, the spirit with which everybody came here. People didn't pull their punches, right? Like people said real things, but they did it with the braver angel spirit. And so I enjoyed the courage and the decency that showed. So we're also seeing a lot of great stuff in the chat, and we're going to do one final poll, which is another way that we gather feedback. And so Cliff, if you would activate the second poll of the evening, and it's just to give us some feedback, that would be great. Looks like there might be oh, there it is. Great. You have 1 minute to answer. Thirty seconds left. Ten seconds. All right, good. So what did folks like about the debate? Top, respect shown to others, 78%. Well done, everybody. Truthfulness and honesty of opinions shared, people sharing their personal experiences, very good. When we asked what the question of did what you heard here tonight, did that affect how you think about this issue? 47% are at strongly agree, somewhat agree. And over 50% are at either somewhat agree or strongly agree. So for all those who think that minds can't be changed or shaped, here we are. And finally, how has your thinking changed about the other side during this debate? 86% say I was more able to see how the other side thinks. So thank you, everyone. And I just want to say again that we are all putting the brave and braver angels here. Everybody who's watching, everybody who's listening, and just one. We have an evaluation link that I would like to ask our attendee whips to put in the chat. We would be grateful if you would fill that out for us. And then I want to ask one of our hardest working volunteers for this debate, Randy, to tell us why he's part of Braver Angels and invite you all into our family. So go ahead, Randy.
Yeah, thanks very much, April. I certainly want to recognize once again the really strong emotions that were swirling around this debate. We heard from so many people who felt so strongly leading up to this event. And I was conflicted myself. We had this conversation, the debate about the debate within my own family, right? But the conversation that I heard among my friends at Braver Angels, including in the lead up to this event, was so heartening for me and reinforced to me how full this organization is of such thoughtful people that, it just feels like such a home. And, we know that conversation itself is just so important. I know people on both sides of this conversation who believe that those on the other side are cynical, that they are beyond the pale, that they're out to destroy the country. And I think we've really seen good faith here, right? Which is the assumption that we really need to start with in these conversations. I just think that is so important. And the Braver Angels way, to me, from what I've seen, is the absolute best way to establish that good faith, that trust, that, the rekindling of those affections of our relationships. So with that, if anyone here has not joined Braver Angel, I ask you to join us and come to more events like debates and workshops and local alliance meetings, and see how those experiences broaden your outlook, just as they have done mine. You may not change your beliefs, but I think you'll find it in that. And it looks like we saw that in the poll, that, you'll find it much easier to understand the beliefs of the other side and to communicate with them. And perhaps you'll even find that you become more influential. So I really want to thank people for joining us. And I really hope to see so many of you at all of our future events. I'm just so excited about the future of our organization and what we can do for this country. So thanks so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Randy. One final round of jazz hands, and then we'll, Randy, take us home with a song, if the tech works this time. Yes.
Yeah. So I have one of our Braver Angels, actually our Braver Angels Song Contest winner that I'm going to be playing. So I'm going to share my my sound real quick here. If you give me a moment, there we go. Okay, and let's play. This is called United States.
It's not black, it's not white, it's not wrong, it's not right, it's not red, it's not blue, it's just me and you. It's not rich, it's not poor, somewhere in the middle is the open door. If our points of view don't quite see eye to eye, well, that's all the more reason why we need a United States of humanity. We need it, we need it. A United States of humanity, the sum of every part. Need a United States of humanity. We need it, we need it. Resolutions in a revolution of the heart. We're living in a great divide. This fear of each other is our suicide. I believe love's gonna keep us alive, but only if we decide. We need a United States of humanity. We need it, we need it. A United States of humanity, the sum of every part. We need a United States of humanity. We need it, we need it. Resolutions in a revolution of the heart. It's not just the conversation, it's the listening. It takes every voice feeling heard to let freedom ring. We can solve our future, heal our history, sting, step toward our common ground, spread our better angel wings. We need a United States of humanity. We need it, we need it. A United States of humanity, the sum of every part. We need a United States of humanity. We need it, we need it. Resolution is a revolution of the heart. Oh, we hold this truth to be self-evident. I have a dream, a United States of humanity. We need it. Resolutions in a revolution of the revolutions in a revolution of the heart.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and good night.